The South African sun beat down on Elon Musk as he stepped out of his rental car. It had been nearly 15 years since he returned to Pretoria, the city where he grew up. At 52, he was now one of the richest men in the world, with companies that built electric cars, rockets, and brain chips. But today, he wasn't here for business. He was here to reconnect with his roots. "Feels smaller than I remember," Elon said to himself as he walked down the street of his old neighborhood. The trees had grown taller, casting longer shadows. The houses looked more worn. Time had changed this place, just as it had changed him. He stopped at a small coffee shop to escape the midday heat. While waiting for his order, he picked up a local newspaper someone had left behind. He flipped through it casually, not expecting to find anything interesting. That's when he saw her face. The black and white photo wasn't very clear, but he recognized her immediately, Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton. Her eyes still had that same sparkle, though her face now showed the deep lines of someone who had lived a full life. The headline above her picture read, "Former educators face housing crisis as costs rise." Elon's hands tightened around the paper as he read the story. Mrs. Thornton, who had taught science at his elementary school for over 30 years, was now living in a run-down apartment complex that was scheduled for demolition. The article mentioned her struggling with medical bills after her husband's death and quoted her saying she might soon have to choose between buying food or medicine. "Sir, your coffee," the barista called out, but Elon barely heard him. His mind had traveled back to 5th grade, sitting in Mrs. Thornton's classroom. He remembered how she'd stayed after school to help him build his first small electric motor. How she defended him when other teachers called his questions disruptive. "That boy doesn't just want answers," she had told them. "He wants to understand how the world works." While other adults laughed at his dreams of space travel and sustainable energy, Mrs. Thornton had given him books about rockets and solar power. "The future belongs to those brave enough to imagine it," she'd written in his yearbook. Elon pulled out his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel everything for the next 2 days," he said firmly, "and find an address for an Elizabeth Thornton here in Pretoria." 3 hours later, Elon stood outside a crumbling apartment building on the edge of town. Paint peeled from the walls, and the security gate hung loosely on broken hinges. He checked the address again, finding it hard to believe his teacher could be living here. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, apartment 3B. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing a thin woman with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a cardigan despite the heat, the kind of practical outfit a teacher might wear. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice still carrying that gentle authority he remembered. "Mrs. Thornton," Elon said quietly. "I'm not sure if you remember me. I was in your class back in—" "Elon Musk?" She cut him off, her eyes widening with recognition. "My goodness." Her hand went to her heart as if to steady it. "I'd know that his eyes anywhere, always looking beyond what's in front of you." For a moment, the billionaire who could command any room stood speechless. Then Mrs. Thornton did something unexpected. She reached out and straightened his collar, just like she used to do before school presentations. "Still not tucking in your shirts properly, I see," she said with a warm smile. That simple gesture broke something open in Elon. Before he knew it, he was hugging his former teacher, careful not to squeeze too tight. She seemed so much more fragile than the woman in his memories. "Would you like to come in for tea?" she asked, stepping back. "I don't have much, but I'd love to hear what you've been up to. Though I suspect I already know. I've been following your journey all these years." As she led him into her small apartment, Elon noticed the newspaper clippings carefully taped to one wall. A collage of his achievements over the decades. And in that moment, he knew his trip home had taken an unexpected turn, one that would soon change not just Mrs. Thornton's life, but the lives of teachers everywhere. Mrs. Thornton's apartment was small but spotlessly clean. Every surface shined, and despite the peeling wallpaper and worn furniture, there was a sense of pride in how she kept her home. She gestured for Elon to sit on a faded blue couch while she disappeared into the tiny kitchen. "I hope you don't mind tea bags," she called out. "I save the loose leaf for special occasions." "Tea bags are perfect," Elon replied, looking around the room. Beside the wall of newspaper clippings about him, he noticed shelves lined with photos of students from across the decades. In some of the older pictures, he spotted himself, skinny, serious-faced, holding up science fair ribbons. Mrs. Thornton returned with 2 chipped mugs, setting them on a small coffee table that had been carefully repaired multiple times. "So," she said, lowering herself slowly into an armchair across from him, "what brings the great Elon Musk back to Pretoria? Surely not to visit an old teacher." There was no bitterness in her voice, just gentle teasing. The same tone she'd used when catching him reading rocket books under his desk during history lessons. "Actually, that's exactly why I'm here," Elon said. "I saw the article in the paper about your housing situation." He hesitated, not wanting to embarrass her. "I wanted to see if there was any way I could help." Mrs. Thornton's eyes dropped to her tea. For a moment, the confident teacher disappeared, replaced by an elderly woman who seemed ashamed of her circumstances. "It's been a difficult few years," she admitted quietly. "After Tom passed away, that's my husband, the medical bills took most of our savings. The school pension doesn't go as far as it used to." She straightened her shoulders. "But I manage. I'd always been resourceful." "You taught me to be resourceful too," Elon said. "Remember when the school wouldn't fund that energy project and you helped me find ways to build it from recycled parts?" Her face brightened. "Of course I remember. You were determined to make a solar water heater even though we had no budget," she laughed. "You convinced the cafeteria to give you their discarded aluminum trays. So clever." They fell into easy conversation, with Mrs. Thornton sharing stories about her 40 years of teaching. She pulled out photo albums, pointing to faces of doctors, engineers, and artists who had once been wide-eyed children in her classroom. "Teaching wasn't just a job for me," she explained. "It was my purpose. I never needed much money because I felt rich in other ways." Her voice caught slightly. "At least, that's what I tell myself on the hard days." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the thin curtains, Mrs. Thornton finally asked the question Elon had been dreading. "Tell me honestly, how bad do I look compared to what you remember?" Elon considered her face, thinner now, with deeper lines around her eyes, but still bright with intelligence and kindness. "You look exactly like the person who changed my life," he answered truthfully. Mrs. Thornton blinked rapidly, looking away. "Such a charmer. You always did know the right thing to say to get out of turning in homework on time." Elon laughed, but then grew serious. "Mrs. Thornton, can I ask you something? If you could have anything right now, what would it be?" She thought for a moment. "A garden," she said finally. "Where I live now, there's nowhere to grow things. I miss having my hands in the soil, watching seeds become something beautiful and useful." She smiled wistfully. "My classroom always had plants everywhere, remember? The principal used to joke that I was running a jungle instead of a science lab." "I remember," Elon said softly. "You taught us about ecosystems using those plants." When Elon finally stood to leave, the sky had darkened. Mrs. Thornton walked him to the door, moving more slowly than she had hours earlier, fatigue evident in the slight stoop of her shoulders. "Thank you for the visit," she said. "It meant more than you know." "I'll see you again before I leave town," Elon promised. As he walked down the dimly lit stairwell, his mind was already racing with plans. By the time he reached his car, he had made 3 phone calls and sent 5 texts. His driver, waiting patiently, noticed the determined look on his face. "Everything okay, sir?" he asked. "No," Elon replied, his voice firm. "But it will be." Back in his hotel room, Elon couldn't sleep. The image of Mrs. Thornton's brave smile as she served tea in chipped mugs wouldn't leave his mind. He paced the luxurious suite, feeling the sharp contrast between his current life and hers. Outside his window, the Pretoria skyline glittered with lights, indifferent to the struggles of a retired teacher who had shaped so many young minds. Elon pulled out his laptop and began searching through old photos stored in his cloud. There it was, his 5th grade class picture. 27 kids with awkward smiles and Mrs. Thornton standing proudly behind them, a hand resting on his shoulder. He zoomed in on her face, so much younger then, but with the same determined expression. He remembered the day she'd pulled him aside after he'd been bullied for talking about building rockets. "They laugh because they can't see what you see," she had told him. "But someday, what you build will change how everyone sees the world." Those words had carried him through his darkest moments, when his companies nearly went bankrupt, when critics called him a fraud, when the rockets exploded on the launch pad. He'd heard her voice in his head, pushing him forward. Feeling restless, Elon opened social media and typed Elizabeth Thornton Teacher Pretoria into the search bar. To his surprise, dozens of results appeared. Former students spanning 4 decades had mentioned her in posts about their careers and lives. A doctor in Cape Town, 20 years as a surgeon, and I still hear Mrs. Thornton telling me to double-check my work. She made us label all parts of the frog before dissection. Attention to detail saves lives, she'd say. An environmental scientist in Australia. When I won the Conservation Award today, I thought of Mrs. T, who taught us to look at how all living things connect. She made us grow plants with different soils and track the results for a whole semester. A software engineer in India. My coding professor at university was impressed I already understood logical sequences. Thank you, Mrs. Thornton, for those paper programming exercises you created before our school had computers. Elon kept scrolling, finding more and more stories. Some from wealthy professionals, others from people in modest careers, but all speaking of her impact on their lives. He began taking notes, capturing details from their stories. Around 3 a.m., he opened a new document and started writing, ideas flowing faster than his fingers could type. By sunrise, he had a rough plan sketched out, not just for Mrs. Thornton, but for something much bigger. His phone rang. It was his assistant reminding him about his flight back to Texas scheduled for that afternoon. Cancel it, Elon said, and book me a meeting room at the hotel. I'm staying a few more days. Should I reschedule the board meeting? His assistant asked. No, Elon replied. I'll call in remotely. But I need you to set up some local meetings here in Pretoria. First, I need the best real estate agent in town. Then contact our foundation team and find out which law firms here specialize in setting up educational trusts. His assistant paused. May I ask what this is about? Elon looked at the class photo still open on his screen. It's about paying back a debt that's long overdue. After hanging up, he went to the window and watched the sun rise over the city where he'd grown up. The boy who had dreamed of rockets while other kids played soccer. The boy who might have given up if not for a teacher who believed in him. He thought about all the other Mrs. Thorntons out there, dedicated teachers who shaped futures but couldn't secure their own. People who gave everything to their students but were forgotten once the classroom door closed behind them. His phone buzzed with notifications as his team began setting meetings for the day. Elon took one last look at the old class photo before closing his laptop. The way we treat our teachers, he said to himself, says everything about what we truly value. He showered quickly and dressed, energy coursing through him like it did before every major launch or product reveal. But this felt different. This wasn't about technology or business strategies. This was about recognizing the human connections that make everything else possible. By the time he headed downstairs to his first meeting, Elon had the clear-eyed focus his employees recognized as the sign of a new mission taking shape. 3 days passed before Elon returned to Mrs. Thornton's apartment building. This time, he wasn't alone. A small team of people followed him, an architect, a doctor, and his personal assistant who carried a large envelope. When they reached her door, Elon knocked softly. The door opened, and Mrs. Thornton's eyes widened at the sight of so many people in the narrow hallway. Elon? I wasn't expecting you back so soon, and with friends. May we come in? He asked. I have something I'd like to discuss with you. Once they were all seated, the professionals perched awkwardly on Mrs. Thornton's worn furniture. Elon began explaining. Mrs. Thornton, when I left here the other day, I couldn't stop thinking about everything you gave me. Not just the science lessons, but the confidence to believe in my ideas. He leaned forward. I want to help you, if you'll let me. Mrs. Thornton's expression turned guarded. That's very kind, but I don't accept charity. I've always taken care of myself. It's not charity, Elon said quickly. Think of it as a very delayed payment for all those extra hours you spent after school helping me with my projects. He nodded to his assistant, who handed him the envelope. From it, Elon pulled out some papers with photos attached. This is a house about 15 minutes from here, he explained, showing her pictures of a modest but beautiful single-story home with a large garden. It has wide doorways and no steps, so it's easy to move around in as you get older. And look at the backyard. Plenty of space for all the plants you could want to grow. Mrs. Thornton's hands trembled as she looked at the photos. I don't understand. I want to buy this house for you. Or rather, set up a trust that will provide it and take care of all maintenance and property taxes for as long as you need it. But, she began. Please, Elon interrupted gently. The doctor here has reviewed your husband's medical history, and we can see that the bills you faced weren't your fault. Insurance should have covered more. It was the system that failed you, not the other way around. The doctor nodded. We've arranged for better healthcare coverage too, through a special program. Mrs. Thornton sat very still, her eyes filling with tears that she tried to blink away. I can't possibly accept something so enormous, she whispered. Elon smiled. Would it help if I told you I spend more on office furniture every month than this house costs? This means nothing to my bank account, but it would mean everything to me to know you're taken care of properly. Later that afternoon, after the professionals had left, Elon and Mrs. Thornton sat in her tiny kitchen, drinking tea one last time in the apartment she would soon leave behind. There's one condition to all this, Elon said seriously. Mrs. Thornton raised an eyebrow. I knew there had to be a catch. When you're settled in your new home, I want you to help me with a project. I need your expertise as an educator. Before she could ask what he meant, Elon's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. I'm sorry, but local news somehow got hold of this story. There are reporters gathering outside. Mrs. Thornton peeked through her curtains at the small crowd forming below. Oh dear. I've never been in the news before. When they finally left the building, cameras flashed and reporters called out questions. Elon stepped in front of Mrs. Thornton protectively, but she gently moved beside him, standing straighter than she had in days. Mr. Musk, one reporter shouted, is it true you've purchased a home for your former teacher? Elon looked at Mrs. Thornton, who nodded slightly, giving permission to answer. Mrs. Thornton invested in me when all I had were ideas, Elon said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. She spent her career investing in thousands of children, shaping their futures, but our society failed to invest in her retirement security. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Teachers shape the future more than any CEO ever could. This isn't charity. It's a long overdue return on her investment in me and countless others. As cameras flashed, Mrs. Thornton stood tall beside the billionaire who had once been her student, her face showing not embarrassment but quiet dignity. The video of Elon and Mrs. Thornton outside her apartment building spread like wildfire across the internet. By morning, it had been viewed over 20 million times. News shows played the clip of Elon saying, "Teachers shaped the future more than any CEO ever could," on repeat. Elon woke up to thousands of messages. Some were from celebrities and business leaders offering support. Others were from ordinary people sharing stories about teachers who changed their lives. But the ones that hit hardest were from retired teachers living in similar circumstances to Mrs. Thornton, proud educators now struggling to make ends meet. He scrolled through message after message on his phone while drinking his morning coffee in the hotel restaurant. An elderly man at a nearby table was watching a news show featuring the story. When Elon's face appeared on screen, the man turned and did a double take, realizing who was sitting nearby. My wife was a teacher for 37 years, the man said, walking over to Elon's table. What you're doing for that woman, it's good to see someone who remembers. After the man left, Elon called his team. Cancel my flight again. We need to think bigger. That afternoon, Mrs. Thornton visited her new home for the first time. Elon watched her face as she walked through each room, her fingers trailing along smooth countertops, her eyes wide at the accessible shower with safety rails. When they reached the backyard, she gasped. A small greenhouse stood in one corner, already filled with starter plants and gardening tools. This is too much, she whispered. It's exactly enough, Elon replied, but it's just the beginning. Later, they sat on her new porch, watching the sunset. Elon pulled out his tablet and showed her what he'd been working on all day. I'm calling it the Educator Impact Foundation, he explained, showing her the rough website his team had built. I'm putting in $100 million to start. The money will help retired teachers who are struggling financially, but that's just the first step. Mrs. Thornton adjusted her glasses as she read through the plans. This says you want to build housing communities specifically for retired teachers. Elon nodded. Affordable, accessible housing with shaded gardens and libraries. Places where teachers can live with dignity after giving their lives to their students. He paused. But I need your help to get it right. My help? Mrs. Thornton looked surprised. What could I possibly offer to something this big? Everything, Elon said. You understand what teachers need better than I ever could. I want you to help shape this foundation. Be on the advisory board. Tell me where the money should go. That evening, Elon posted a message on social media that would change everything. It was simple, heartfelt, and hit a nerve around the world. Today, I found myself thinking about an odd contradiction in our society. We entrust teachers with our most precious resource, our children, yet we fail to ensure these same teachers can live securely after decades of service. What does this say about what we truly value? I'm launching the Educator Impact Foundation with $100 million of my own money, but this isn't about charity. It's about correcting a fundamental flaw in how we treat those who build our future. This isn't a Musk project. It's an everyone project. He attached a short video showing Mrs. Thornton in her classroom years ago, taken from old school records, intercut with recent footage of her in her rundown apartment. The final shot showed her standing in her new garden, dignity restored. The post exploded online. #EveryOn project began trending within hours. News channels picked it up, and talk shows debated the state of teacher compensation and retirement systems. Politicians issued statements supporting teacher pension reform. Celebrities posted about their favorite teachers. By midnight, Elon's phone rang. It was his foundation director. Sir, you need to see this. We've received matching pledge commitments totaling over $30 million already. And that's just from private individuals. Corporate pledges are starting to come in too. Elon smiled. Send me the top 10 most compelling stories from teachers who've reached out. And book a conference room tomorrow. We need to move faster. As he hung up, a new message appeared from Mrs. Thornton. I just watched your video. My teacher friends are calling nonstop. What have you started, young man? Elon texted back, something that should have been started long ago. 2 months after Elon's first visit to Mrs. Thornton's apartment, he sat in a television studio in New York. Across from him was a popular talk show host known for tough questions. The lights were hot, and makeup people had just finished powdering his forehead. We're on in 30 seconds, a producer called out. The host leaned forward. I'm not going easy on you just because it's a good cause, she warned with a smile. I wouldn't expect you to, Elon replied. The cameras rolled, and after a brief introduction, the host dove right in. So, Mr. Musk, many people are calling your Educator Impact Foundation the most significant development in teacher welfare in decades. Did you expect this level of response? Elon shifted in his seat. Honestly, no. When I first helped Mrs. Thornton, it was personal, just trying to give back to someone who had given me so much. But then all these stories started pouring in. Teachers who had shaped generations of students now unable to afford their medications or living in their cars. It felt like we discovered a hidden crisis that everyone knew about but nobody was talking about. The show cut to a clip from a documentary that had been hastily produced in the past month. It showed elderly teachers in various states across the country sharing their stories. A white-haired man in glasses described choosing between heart medication and heating his home. A retired kindergarten teacher showed the cramped RV where she now lived full-time. Each story was more heartbreaking than the last. When the cameras returned to the studio, the host's tone had softened. Your foundation has already raised over $500 million in commitments. How are you deciding where the money goes? That's where Mrs. Thornton and our teacher advisory board come in, Elon explained. We've identified 3 priorities. First, emergency relief for retired educators in immediate crisis. Second, building affordable housing communities designed specifically for teachers. And third, this is the big one, pushing for systemic change in how teacher pensions are structured and protected. The interview continued with Elon sharing stories of former teachers who had reached out. When asked about criticism that this was just a publicity stunt, Elon's face grew serious. Anyone who thinks that should talk to Mrs. Thornton. This isn't about me looking good. It's about recognizing that the people who shape our children's futures deserve security in their own futures. It's that simple. After the interview, Elon checked his phone to find dozens of messages. The most interesting was from the governor of California, who wanted to discuss partnering with the foundation on a statewide initiative for teacher housing. Across the country, Mrs. Thornton was watching the interview on her new television. Her living room was filled with other retired teachers from her district, all gathered to watch their former colleagues' student change the national conversation. "I still can't believe this is happening," said Mrs. Wilson, who had taught English for 35 years and now worked part-time at a grocery store to supplement her pension. "I can," Mrs. Thornton replied. "I remember that look in his eye when he was 10 years old. Once he decides something matters, nothing stops him." Her phone buzzed with a text from Elon. "How did I do?" She smiled and typed back, "B+. Good points, but you talked too fast when explaining the pension reform. Some old habits never change." The next morning, newspaper headlines announced that 3 more billionaires had joined Elon's initiative, each pledging $100 million to the foundation. A tech CEO in Silicon Valley announced a matching program for her employees' donations. A famous basketball player revealed plans to build teacher housing communities in 5 cities where he had played during his career. But perhaps most importantly, state legislators across the country began introducing bills they called Thornton Acts, measures designed to protect teacher pensions and ensure retirement security for educators. On a Zoom call with the foundation's rapidly growing team, Elon shared his screen to show everyone the latest numbers. "In just 2 months, we've identified over 15,000 retired teachers in crisis situations and provided emergency grants to 3,000. Construction begins on our first housing community next week, and we've got meetings with pension officials in 12 states. He paused, looking at the faces filling his screen: policy experts, housing developers, financial advisors, and at the center, Mrs. Thornton herself, looking more energized than he had ever seen her. "I think we're just getting started," he said. 2 years had passed since that fateful day when Elon spotted Mrs. Thornton's photo in a Pretoria newspaper. Now, thousands of people gathered under a bright blue South African sky for the grand opening of the Thornton Center for Educational Excellence. The sprawling campus stood on what had once been an empty field on the outskirts of Pretoria. Modern buildings with solar panel roofs surrounded a central garden filled with native plants. Behind the main building, rows of comfortable homes formed a semicircle, the first teacher retirement community in Africa, already filled with retired educators who had once faced uncertain futures. Elon adjusted his tie nervously as he waited backstage. This wasn't like launching a new electric car or announcing a Mars mission. This felt more important somehow. "Are you ready?" asked his assistant, checking her watch. "Is Mrs. Thornton here yet?" Elon asked. "She's in the front row. She looks beautiful." Moments later, Elon walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Camera flashes lit up the crowd. Government officials, business leaders, and celebrities filled the first few rows. But Elon's eyes went straight to Mrs. Thornton, now 78 years old, but sitting tall in a bright blue dress, her silver hair styled elegantly for the occasion. 2 years ago, Elon began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "I returned to my hometown and discovered something that changed my life for a second time. I found that my elementary school science teacher, the woman who first believed in my crazy ideas about space and sustainable energy, was living in poverty." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. That day led to a simple question: how can we claim to value education while allowing those who provide it to struggle in their retirement years? That question has now been answered in 27 countries. The Educator Impact Foundation has helped over 40,000 retired teachers secure housing, healthcare, and financial stability. But today marks our most ambitious project yet. Elon gestured to the buildings behind him. The Thornton Center isn't just a retirement community. It's a place where veteran teachers will train the next generation of educators, where teaching will be treated as the vital profession it is, where the wisdom of experience will be passed down, not lost when a teacher retires. He walked to the edge of the stage where Mrs. Thornton sat. "Mrs. Thornton, would you please join me?" With the help of a young teacher, Mrs. Thornton made her way up the steps. The crowd rose to their feet, applauding as teacher and former student stood side by side. Many wiped away tears. "Mrs. Thornton, when I was 10 years old, you told me something I never forgot. You said that ideas can change the world, but only if we're brave enough to act on them." Elon turned to face her directly. "Your idea, that every child deserves a teacher who believes in them, changed my world. And now it's changing the world for teachers everywhere." He handed her a large ceremonial key. "Would you do the honor of officially opening the center that bears your name?" Mrs. Thornton took the key with trembling hands. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "When I became a teacher 58 years ago, I never imagined standing here today. I just wanted to open young minds to the wonders of science and possibility." She looked out at the crowd. "To all the teachers here and around the world watching this broadcast, what you do matters. It matters more than you can ever know. Sometimes the seeds you plant take decades to grow, but when they do—" She gestured toward Elon and the buildings behind them. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. After the ceremony, Elon and Mrs. Thornton walked slowly through the gardens. Student teachers followed at a respectful distance, whispering excitedly about being in the presence of the woman whose name was now synonymous with teacher advocacy worldwide. "So," Mrs. Thornton said, pausing beside a bench near a bubbling fountain, "what's next for you?" "Mars." Elon laughed. "Eventually. But first, we're breaking ground on similar centers in 12 more countries next month. The Foundation Board wants you to choose which one to open first." Mrs. Thornton shook her head in amazement. "From one apartment visit to all this. I still can't quite believe it." "I can," Elon said softly. "You taught me that the right idea at the right time can change everything." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the campus, a group of young children from a nearby school approached with hand-drawn cards. They had come to thank the famous teacher and her equally famous former student for showing the world what happens when we truly value those who shape our future. Mrs. Thornton bent down to accept their cards, her face alight with the same passion for connecting with young minds that had defined her life. In that moment, Elon knew that of all his achievements, this might be the one that mattered most.